What's good, team? Welcome to another Small James coding tutorial where today we're going to be learning Qwik, the fastest JavaScript framework on the planet, O of 1 loading time. If you want to know more about how that works, check out Fireship's video on it. But in this tutorial, we're going to be building an e-commerce store in Qwik so that you can learn all the skills that you need to go and build your own blazingly fast applications today. Now this tutorial will also be using Tailwind instead of CSS. Super easy to learn. You can learn it in the tutorial, so no stress there. So here's a quick demo of the app we're going to be building today. It's a corgi purchasing site where we've got all sorts of cool things like this fun nav bar, we've got buttons, we've got a whole lot of cards that look excellent, and basically you can purchase all of these corgis. Obviously everything is mobile responsive. And add them to your cart. So let's say we wanted Noodle. Noodle comes up, we can adopt Noodle. Noodle is added to our cart. We can go to the home page and let's say we want to add Ein as well. Let's say we even wanted two of them. And then we have Noodle, Ein, and Ein in our cart, and we can remove them and everything. So that's pretty much it. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and sub, super appreciated. Let's get into it. So to dive in, the first thing I'm going to do is open up a terminal inside of my Visual Studio Code editor, and I'm going to cd into my project directory. And here what we're going to do is run npm create Qwik at latest. And this is going to initialize a Qwik app for us where we can give it a name. So I'm going to call this Corgi Store. We're going to have a basic app. We're going to install our dependencies, which is going to happen pretty quickly. And now we can cd into Corgi Store and consequently open that folder here. So if you just find it, Corgi Store, easy peasy, we have that open. Now the next thing we're going to do is follow through these Tailwind instructions so that we can get Tailwind up and running. And so I'm just going to verbatim copy them across, paste them in just like that. Super straightforward. Copy all of this into our Tailwind config file, just here. And finally, copy these styles across into our source global CSS sheet right at the top. And now that that's done, I'm just quickly going to run you through the directory so that we know what we're looking at. And that begins with our public folder, which is node modules and .vs Code. You don't really have to worry about because we won't touch them. The public directory is where we keep all of our static assets, so everything that you want to ship with your app. So that could be images, fonts, any other kind of asset. And then the other folder of significance is our source folder. And in here we have some files that we don't really have to touch. So like your root is basically just where Qwik makes all the magic happen and renders everything into an HTML document. Global CSS is any global CSS styles that you want to set. And then we have some entry files that we don't really have to stress about, and we can just leave them be. However, the ones that we will be interacting with is our components. And so in our component directory, we just have folders per component. Here we have modular CSS sheets, which aren't really going to be used in this tutorial because we're going to be using Tailwind. And then we just have component names, which is similar to React, so great for reusability and all that kind of stuff. So we'll have a lot of component logic in our tutorial. And then we obviously have routes, which is similar to how Next.js runs routes. So it's basically just a directory-based layout. So if we were to go to the suffix or the /flower domain route, it would render this index.typescript file. And consequently, if we just have our root file or our home directory, we render this index. And we have stuff like a layout that generally applies across all of our different routes. So now that we've had a quick look at the directory, the files, and all that kind of stuff, we just have to configure a couple of things real quick into our document. And the first thing is going to be a font, and then the second thing is going to be an asset package that we're going to need for this. And so for the asset package, that's going to be font awesome icons, which is just an icon set. And if you just Google Font Awesome 6.0 CDN, maybe the version will change, you just want the latest version, it will bring you here and you can just copy the top link. All these links are going to be in the description as well. And we can come into our root and paste that link in the head of our document. Just like that, super easy. Now, the next one we're going to need is our Google Fonts. And for this particular tutorial, we're going to be using Just. So you can just come into Fonts and search up Just and it will be right there. And then when you add a series of them, so I've already added them, you can see over here that we have a little link tag that we can just copy across. So there's actually 3 link tags. We need all of them. So I'm going to copy them and paste them directly under here. And we just need to close both of them to make sure the syntax is correct. And now what we can do is come into our global CSS, select everything in our document, and say font family is Just with a backup of sans serif. While we're here, we're just also going to say transition duration of 300 milliseconds, because that's just going to be incredibly useful throughout our tutorial. And now we are finally ready to run npm run start, which will serve up our boilerplate app at localhost 5173. And here you can see we have our app right there. And now if I come into the root of the document, actually scratch that, come into the routes index, we should be able to come in here and say class name text green 400. And we can see that our Tailwind style applies perfectly and that color is updated to green. While we're here, we can also just quickly check that the icon set is working properly. And so for that, we can just come into Font Awesome Icons. And let's say I look up Instagram. We can go from their free icons, copy this into here just like that. Let's say we put it right there. And consequently, we get that Instagram icon showing up as well. So that's all working, and we have successfully configured our project. So now the next step for us is going to be to gut everything that currently exists. And we can start off doing that in our main file here just by selecting all of this. Remove all of that, so that's just about all gone. We can change this configuration right here. So you'll see that here we have a title and a meta. We can update that. So there's the welcome to Qwik to, let's just say we call this Corgito, just like that. So that's the name of the store. The description can go there and everything. So we could say purchase corgis, just like that. And equivalently, we can come into our layout and just gut everything from here as well. So we can empty that and come into our components and our header. Firstly, we can actually delete this CSS sheet. We can remove this styling stuff and just get rid of everything in there. And finally, we'll want to come into our global CSS sheet and just get rid of everything in here because we don't need any of it. So now we have a completely blank project that we can make do whatever we want. And the first thing we're going to be doing is coming into our document here. Actually, I lie, we're going to be coming into our root and making just about the only changes we're going to need to make in here. And so that is just going to be adding a class is equal to flex and flex col, in addition to a min height of the screen. And now if I change the background to green 200, we should see that our entire page turns green, which it does indeed, and that minimum height is being occupied. So that's perfect. So that gives us the liberty to close that and come into our layout file. And so in here, we want this main to take up all of the available width, flex 1, because it's going to be a flex child, and that will push this footer to the bottom. So if I type James there, we expect James to show up at the bottom, which it does, which is perfect. And while we're in here, we're just going to give this a flex and flex col additionally. And we also want this to occupy a minimum height of the screen. So that will actually just push our footer slightly lower, which is of no concern. The next thing that we're going to be doing is coming into our index file, and in here, we're going to start off by giving this a class of flex1, and now if I type in background yellow 200, I would have expected to get the maximum occupancy of the page, but it hasn't because it's actually wrapped within a section. So I can remove that section just like that, and now we get that yellow page. And the reason we need to do that is because we're going to have an image in here, and this is going to be our first component. So we're going to have an image, and it's going to have a source equal to corgi pictures. If we go images, we want tools. Where on earth is tools? Tools size is going to be large. And for this tutorial, I am going to open this image in a new tag and take this picture. So we want to copy that link and paste it in here with the alt equal to corgi homepage. And so now if I close that and come back into our document, we get a stretched image, which we can fix by saying class is equal to object cover, just like that. So now we have our home page, and on top of this we can start adding our navbar and everything else, which will look excellent. So for our navbar, what we're going to have to do is come into our header document, but first actually we're going to have to come into our main and add a relative to this particular here, because our header is going to be absolute, and we can add that with a class that just says absolute. Well, actually, even more so, it needs to be fixed, and it's going to have a top of 0, a left of 0, and a width of full. And it's also going to have a display of flex. We're going to justify the content between, and we're going to have align items center, which is actually just meant to be items center, just like that. And inside here, we're going to have an h1 tag that says corgitos, or corgito, just like that. And we're also going to have an icon, which is going to be a cart. And now we can click on this cart just here, copy that, paste it right there, and we should see those icons pop up, and they do, which is perfect. Now, what we're going to do additionally is just give this a padding of 4 to push them in a little bit, just like that. And we're going to start off designing for a small screen and then go up. However, I'm also just going to put this inside of a div, and we will see why shortly. Now, the next thing that we want to do is set the text to white. So it's just like that. And we can say text extra large for a smaller screen, and then when we go bigger, we could say like text 4XL. Oh, 4XL. So now when I come up onto a bigger screen, we can see that it jumps up in size, drops down, jumps up. And honestly, we could possibly just make this an independent size that just is like text extra large, small. Maybe we just want it to be 2XL, or we could possibly go 3, just so it's not as big. Perfect. And the last thing we want to do is just on a bigger screen, we want to give it some more padding, so we're going to upgrade the padding to 8. So now when we come up onto a big screen, it looks just like that. And that will stick at the top. And that now brings us to the next thing that we can do, which is super clever. And in here, we can add a document.onScroll event, pass in an anonymous function. And what we're going to do is we're going to make it that when the user scrolls off the head of the page, we're going to set the background to white. Sorry, we're going to set the background to black so that the header always stands out. And the way that we can do that is just by saying if window.scrollY is greater than 0 as we scroll down, we just want to set the store.scrolled equal to true, and else we want the store.scrolled equal to false. And what that represents is a state that we haven't defined yet. And to initialize the state, what we have to do is import use store just up here, and we can say const store is equal to, or you could say state, but we're going to go with store is equal to use store, and we're just going to make an object and say scrolled is equal to false, and that should be set like this as an object. And now when we scroll this document, it's going to set the scrolled property to true when we scroll away from the top of the page, and otherwise if it's equal to 0, then it will set it to false. And that just means that we can give this a dynamic style, and we can do that by adding a curly brace around this, and we can add a dynamic JavaScript element. So we can say store.scrolled, if I can spell. If it's true, that means we're off the top of the page and we just want to set the background to slate 900. Otherwise we want to do nothing. And we could just, call that background transparent. So now when we scroll off the top of the page, we get that happening, come up to the top. And it just means that when we scroll down, we always have this banner up the top that just looks nice and neat. So with that done, the next thing we can do is create a new folder, and this is going to be called products grid. And in here we can make a new file called productsgrid.tsx. And what I'm going to do is just initially copy this entire thing across and then gut it of all the content and just replace that with a div. We also don't need the store in this particular instance. And now what I can do is come into my index document, and underneath this image, I can render out the next element that we need, which is going to be the product grid. However, the one issue with this so far is that we're going to have to turn this into a flex col and actually wrap this main page inside of a section. And the reason is because we're going to want a button here that's going to have the effect of scrolling the user. And so the way that we can achieve this is by, instead of having our layout have this min height screen, I can instead come in here and give this section a class of min height screen and a display of flex. And so now once again the dog occupies the majority of the page, and if we set this to relative, that allows us to place a button in the middle. So I'm just going to have a button here, and it's going to have a class of absolute because it's going to be absolutely positioned relative to this page. And we're going to say left is half, top is going to be 2/3 down. We're going to minus translate y half of the width of the element. We're going to give it a padding of 4, a border solid, border white, and inside of here it's just going to say shop corgis. So now we have this. We should also make sure that's slightly thicker, and we can have a text white. So now we have that little button. I'm also just going to have to do the minus translate x1/2 so that it's actually centered in the page. And we can see that we've actually lost our header, and we can resolve that by just coming in here and giving that a z of 20, and that comes back onto the page. We could even make it 40 for the sake of things. And we're also actually just going to change this button to an anchor and come into our section grid and give this an ID of products, because we want this button to href us to products. And so what that will mean is that when we click on this, it's going to scroll us down to that. However, that was an instantaneous scroll, which is super gross, and so we can come into here and just say scroll behavior smooth. And so now when I'm at the top of the page and I click shop, it slowly scrolls us down and our header comes up. So that is amazing. The next thing we're going to do is just give this href a couple more styles so it looks a little better. And we're going to be super clever by saying hover text slate 900, but also open this up onto a new line and wrap this inside of an h3, just like that. And the reason we need to do that will become apparent in a second, but we'll just have to give this a class of relative z20, and that allows us to use the after effects just in here, so we can say after absolute, after background white, after right full, after top 0, after width full, after height full. So I'm basically creating a square with a background of white that has the dimensions that exactly matches the button. However, I'm pushing it all the way off to the side, which means that but what I'm going to do is have on hover, have the after effect translate X full, and we should see that now. So you can see that when I hover, the after effect comes across and the text changes color. And we can slow that down by saying after duration 300, and we can remove the box from the left by saying overflow hidden. And so that leaves us with a button just like that, so we can shop corgis and it will show up all nice and pretty. Now I might actually just update the padding X to be slightly larger, so px of 8. And I'm also just going to say text center, so that when we come down onto a smaller screen, it stays the same. And so now when we click shop corgis, it takes us down to that product section down there. As for our products div, what I'm going to do is define a whole lot of corgis, and so that's going to be just like this, and this is going to be an array because we're going to map it onto the page, and it's going to be an array full of objects where each object has a name, a URL, and a price, just like this. And so now let's say I duplicate that 6 times, and now we can go corgi shopping, and I might actually just come in here and add one last little thing. I'll give that a shadow when it's there, just so it looks slightly neater. And now we can come to the corgi pictures and get a whole lot of beautiful corgis. So there's 1, there's 2, there's 3, 4, 5. Well, we've already used that one, so that doesn't really count. 5, 6, and 7. Perfect. And so we can come in here, copy the image address, and paste it in as URL. So we're just going to do that a bunch of times. Copy the image address, paste it in as URL, copy the image address, paste it in as URL, copy the image address, paste it in as URL. Already used that one for the home page. Copy the image address, paste it in as URL. Copy the image address, paste it in as URL. So there's our selection of beautiful animals. And now we can give them all names. So this one's going to be called Douglas. The price might be 1,500. This one's going to be called Noodle. The price is going to be 4,000. This one can be Courgette. The price can be, let's say 1,200. This one is going to be Waffles. Oh, that's the wrong one. Waffles. Banana nut muffin. Bakery. And Ein. Oh no, that's already done, so I might actually just change this to Ein. And for the rest of the prices, this one can be 1,400. This one can be 2,500, and this one can be 12,000. And what that means is that we can give this a class of min height screen so that it also occupies the full width of the screen. If I come back here, now we have that, and shopping corgis takes us down here. And we also want to give this a display of grid and place items center, because inside of here we're going to have a secondary div that has a class of flex, flex column gap, maybe 4, flex wrap, so that all the items wrap. And now we can map out a card for each of them by saying corgis.map, and let's just say we call this object. And here we can return what I'm going to call card, and we can go ahead and create card in our components by saying card, just like that. Create a new file, card.tsx. And once again, we're just going to copy the header into the card, clear out all of the unrequired content, replace it with a div, just like that. And now we can import the card successfully and render that out onto the page. And we can write James in here, and now we should have a whole lot of Jameses displayed onto the page. Absolutely perfect. Now the next thing we're going to have to do is pass props, and the way that we can do that is by coming into the card component and writing props in here. And then what we can do is just destructure all of the information out of the props by saying URL name price is equal to props, and when we pass it down we can just spread the object just like that. And now in here, if I console.log URL, we can see that we get all the URLs coming down onto the page. So that is super easy. Equally, what you could do is be more specific and say URL is equal to object.url. But if we're just, I don't want to have to do that for all of them, and so I can just use the shorthand syntax right there. And now inside of our card, we can render out an image with a source equal to URL, an alt equal to name, close that. And now we've got all of our beautiful corgis showing up onto the page. And so in this particular card, the next thing we're going to need to do is give this a class equal to flex, flex column, and on small, I might also give it a gap of 2. And what we want is on a small screen, we want to give it a max width of maybe 300 pixels. So that on anything bigger than a small screen, so that on small screens it occupies the full width, but then when we come onto a bigger screen, they have a maximum width allocated. And that should mean that in here we can actually make that a flex display. And now we get this little display right here. And what we can do with that is give this a max width of, let's say, 1000 pixels. Actually, let's say 1400 pixels, and give it a mx of auto, margin x of auto. And what that will mean is that we can add the line justify center to make sure that all of our beautiful corgis are centered on our page, just like that. So these are going to be our little cards for our products, and now we can come in here and start adding some more information to the cards. So the first thing we're going to need to do is down here make a div, and we're going to give this a class of flex, col gap 2, padding of 4, and here we can have an h2 of the name, and we can have a paragraph that is the price, and we just want to add a $sign in front of the price. So now we should have Douglas for that particular price, and then we can fiddle with the font size. So I might say text 2XL, and that will allow us to have all these beautiful little corgis. And then we can also just give each of them a shadow, maybe would look good. So that just looks like it's more of a card. And I believe in here we can say items stretch so that they all occupy the same height. And the way I might just make this slightly more fixed is actually by giving this an image, a class that is just height maybe 32, like that. That actually needs to be more like 96 maybe. And then with the image, we can say object cover. How's that? That's not quite right, so maybe that's too big. So what I might just do is set this to a custom amount of maybe like 140 pixels. How's that? Perhaps we can go a little bit bigger. And perhaps the solution is actually to not have that and make this, let's say we make that 300. Now we get some bigger corgi cards, and I might just give this a padding of 8, padding Y of 8, just like that. And on small screens I might just give it a, so that it sits a bit down from the top. And finally I might just make that specifically so that it's on the smaller screens, and otherwise I'm just going to have it fit perfectly. So on this type of screen we get these perfectly fitting elements, however these gaps are massive, but we can resolve that in a minute. And the issue is because that actually shouldn't be there like that. So if I Control X, we can instead add this here. And now our corgis sit nicely together. We've got a little bit of a gap just there. And then when I come onto this screen, we get these pages with these wonderful animals. So what I'm going to do next is come back into the card and just give it a couple more styles. So the first one is going to be cursor pointer, so that when people hover over it, it has a pointer element. And I'm also going to give it a border, border solid, border transparent. However, on hover, I'm going to change that to border slate 900. And so what that looks like is when we hover on a particular card, you can see that we just get this nice border effect, and it shows that we're actually hovering on a particular dog. Look at all these wonderful animals. So with that done, now what we can do is start setting up the next page, which is where we will send everyone to when they click on a particular corgi. And the way we can do that is similar to how we have this route here, flower. In flower we have an index.typescript, so this is shipped with the boilerplate code that Qwik give you. And so if I come into flower, the route, we have the code that is rendered out inside of this index file. And we can see that because if I come into flower and go into the index, and let's say I type something at the top here, we get James showing up there. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is create our own route, and that is going to be called corgi. And in here I'm just going to create an index.tsx file, and that is going to basically have the same code that we found in here, except I'm going to, sorry, that's the wrong one, that we found in the flower index, except I'm going to gut absolutely everything, clean up all this use effects stuff. Actually, we'll be needing a use client effects, so maybe I'll leave that for a minute. Remove this styles stuff, remove the cleanup, we don't need that. And finally turn this into a div. And in here what we're going to do is get all of the information that we get from the corgi, and the way we're going to communicate information across these two pages is using this card element and what is known as a link. And so we can wrap this in a link just like that, copy this second element down the bottom, and give this an href equals corgi. And now what will happen is if I come back to our home page and click on a corgi, it's going to route us to this corgi page. What we're going to have to do to communicate this information to the secondary page is add an onClick event here. So we're going to pass in an anonymous function to this onClick event, and this is basically just going to set our current corgi to our local state. And so we're just going to say local storage dot set item, and we're going to give it a key of corgi toe perhaps, and we're going to go JSON dot stringify, and we're going to pass in an object. Well, essentially we're just going to spread props inside here. So now when we click on a corgi, it's going to set that corgi information to local storage and route us to this link. And what that means is that in our index file here, we can use this client effect right here and just say const char data is equal to local storage dot get item corgito, and now we can set that to the state. So in here what we're going to do is basically just have name, this is going to be price, and let's say we have URL, and these are just going to be empty strings, just like that. And now what we can do is actually just say state dot name is equal to data dot name, state dot URL is equal to data dot URL, and state dot price is equal to data dot price. And the last thing we have to actually do is just go JSON dot pass, because we have to pass the stringified object. And now we should have access to all of this information. So if I console.log, or even better, if I just display that on the screen, state.name, we should see that when I come back onto the home page, and we can ensure that this whole system is working because I can come into application and local storage. So let's just delete what we currently have. And now I click on Douglas, and for whatever reason it looked like it did not get set to local storage. So let's just have one more look. Application. Okay, so this click event did not work. So if we come into our card, I would have expected that to run. So let's just see if we console.log here. And now the other thing I'm just going to do is remove the other console.log that we have. So we've got two of them. We can remove the URL. Let's go back to the main page. And if I bring that across, let's say we click on Douglas, and Douglas actually does get saved and everything works perfectly. So that is very convenient, and that also means that we can come back into our index file here, and what I'm going to do is just say class, we're going to say flex, min height screen, just like that, and I'm going to have an image which is source equal to state.url. The alt is equal to the state.name. Close that, and that is going to have a class of equal to object cover. And I might actually just also give that a width, full, height, well, actually even better, say absolute, say relative Z10, for example. Actually, maybe that's not the best strategy. So I'll say flex col. We have our beautiful corgi up the top just there. And now what we can do is say gap, maybe like 4. Oh no, actually let's just make that 2. And now we can have a div in here, and this is going to have class of also flex col gap 4. And now we can just give a bit more about the corgi itself. So we can say, you know, h2 name is state state.name, and then we can have a price, so we can have pretty much the same as the first thing, price, state.price. So now we have all the corgi information, and we want to maybe just even remove the gap to be fair. Make this a bit bigger, so we can say class is equal to text extra large. And I actually don't like this, so I'll just remove that. So we have the information on our beautiful corgi, and then underneath of this we can have a button which just says class border slate 900, border solid, width full, and in here we could just say adopt. Just like that. I might also just add some padding, so that's going to be py of 8. So it's a nice big adopt button. Well, actually, let's make that 4. 4, and we can also say, perhaps I just change this to justify between padding 4. So now we have Douglas. Douglas is $1,500, and we can adopt Douglas just like that. So that's pretty straightforward. What I might also just do is, for now, have an empty footer because we don't actually need the footer. And we also just want to come back into the header, and on this h1 here, I'm actually just going to turn this into an anchor tag and give it an href equals to home, so that when we click on Corgito, it just takes us back home. Now we can shop corgis, go to Noodle. Notice that that actually didn't update, and I think that's going to be because in the card, this seems to just work better if we console.log working Corgito, shop corgis, Noodle. Still getting the wrong corgi. Courgette. Okay, so courgette worked. Ein. Okay, no, it appears to be working. Shop corgis. Corgito, come home. Noodle. Noodle is working. Okay, so everything is actually working, so that's good. And so obviously from that product page, we're going to want to be able to adopt and add our corgi to the cart. So let's say we have Noodle. If we want to adopt Noodle, so I might just come into, so I might just give this a hover opacity 50. So now when we hover over that, it just is this little bit of an effect. And honestly, what I might even just do is remove the width full, give it a padding x of 8 and an mx of auto. So now we have this little adopt button. I might even make that 2. So now we can adopt, no, we'll keep it centered. Okay, so mx auto. We can adopt that beautiful little animal, and when we click adopt, what we want to do is have another onClick event with an anonymous function, and we just want to say local storage.set item, and this is going to be the corgi basket. And in here, what we're going to do is set it to whatever it currently was. So we're going to say if, let's just say for the sake of this, in here we have let cur basket equal to, well, actually we'll just initialize it. Actually, no, what we'll do is we'll initialize it to an object that has items, which is an empty list. If local storage.get item corgi basket. So if there's elements in, or corgis in the basket already, what we can do is we can just say cur basket is equal to json.parse local storage.get item corgi basket. If it doesn't exist, it's already initialized, so that's no stress. And now what we can do is we can just say current basket.items.push, and we can just push the name of the current corgi, which is just going to be state.name. And now what we can do is set the current basket, which is going to be json.stringify current basket, just like that. So that should read and write to a basket. So now if I click adopt here, we can see that we get the current basket, and if I adopt twice, we should have 2 noodles in our basket, which we do indeed. And finally, if I wanted to adopt waffles as well, now we have waffles in our basket. And the reason that is excellent is because what we can do now is come up to our header, and in here we can set a state that says num items is just equal to an empty string. And now we can have use client effect, just like that, anonymous function, and we can read in the amount. So if local storage.getItem corgi basket, if it exists, const num items is equal to, let's name it something better, different, num items in basket is equal to local storage.getItem corgi basket, because we've seen that it exists. And now we need to obviously json.parse that. So that's going to be there. And then we can get the items value and get the length of it. And now we can set that. So we can say store dot num items is equal to num items in basket. And now we should be able to render that value to the page, and I might just set that to a default of 0. And so let's say we just have that there, store dot num items. And so we can see that we have 3 items in the basket. And the reason we're doing that is because if we come in here and give this div a position of relative, we can have a secondary div that has a class equal to absolute, top 0, right 0, and in here we can render out store.num items. And that means I can delete it from there. And now that will overlay our element just here. So we can see it just there. And we can give it a background of whatever color you choose. So, you know, in this particular case, maybe we go slate 900. We can say rounded full height for width for text extra small. And now we have a tiny little icon up there where we can say grid place items center so that the text is perfectly centered. And what we might also just do is move that slightly off the top so it's further out, minus right 2. And so now in our basket we can see that we do in fact have 3 items in our basket, and I might just make that 5 and 5, just like that. So now that we know that we have things in our basket, the next obvious thing is to be able to click on that, and so we can go ahead and give that a cursor pointer. And what we're going to do now is add an onClick event here, another anonymous function, except this particular one is going to set another state variable called modal, which is going to initially be set to false. We're going to set it to the inverse of whatever it currently is, or I guess you could just set it true. So we're going to go store.modal is equal to true. And what that is going to look like is a conditionally rendered element in here. So we're going to say store.modal and what I'm going to call modal, which we don't currently have. So that means that we're going to have to once again come into our component, make a new file called modal.tsx. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy this whole element into there and gut everything, turn it into a div, remove all of this good stuff, and we're just going to render out everything in our basket to this particular page. Now, if we save that, we should be able to have that auto import just here. So we can render out the modal. And the way the modal is going to work is it's going to be relative to the, well, actually, technically, it's going to be absolute to the parent component. So we're going to say class fixed, even better, absolute, top 0, right 0. Initially, the width is going to be full and the height is going to be full as well. And we could say background white and Z 50. So what I would expect now is when I click on this, we set the modal to true, and it occupied the entire size, but we actually want this to be the width of the screen. So I'll Control Z that and go back to screen. So now when I click on this, we get a modal that occupies the entire page width. Now what we're going to have to do in here is also receive props, and we're going to define an onClose, just like that, is equal to props. And we're going to have an X button. It's going to be the first thing we have in here. That you'll see how that works in a second. But first, we're just going to set flex col, gap 4, padding 4. And now we can have a div in here that has a class of flex items center justify between. And this can have an H1 that says cart. We can also give this a padding bottom of 4 and a border bottom just like that. And then across from the cart, we can have an icon, which is just going to be from here, and we can just have a close. So we're just going to have this X mark, open that up, paste that in there, give this a class equal to font bold text for XL. And so now in our modal, oops, we just need to set the text color, so that's going to be text slate 900. We click on the modal, we see that we have a cart and we have an X button. So that is perfect. And now we just want the X button to be the onClose. So here we can say on click, and we can just directly pass in on close, which we've got up there. And on close is going to be a function that we can define here. So that's going to be function on close. And all it's going to do is set store.modal equal to false. So now we can pass that into our modal. On close equals on close. And just like that, oh, what have I done there? Close that, refresh the page. Refresh the page. That's not working suddenly, so I might just remove that. And for some reason we've lost access to our modal, and since that's actually not behaving because it turns out we can't pass a function down, what we're instead going to do is actually just copy this JSX and paste it in here directly. So we can just have store.modal and some fragments, and then we can have our div in here just like that, and that way we can access the state from this same component. And so what that means is that we can instead just set store.modal equal to false. So now we open that up, and then we have the closing of the modal, and so everything works nicely. And so we can actually just instead delete that. It's a good thing it's kind of light. And now for the rest of our modal, what we want to do is first come into the inspect, we're just going to have to clear the current state. So if we come into here, we can delete the basket. So we currently have nothing in the basket, which is good. And I'm going to just make this also conditionally render. So store.num items greater than 0 and that element there. And so what's going to happen is in here, after this div where we have this h1, we're going to want to map out all of the items, and we can access them by actually just getting all of the items. So we can just say cart is equal to an array. And in here we can actually just set the const car basket is equal to this. And what we can say is then this is just equal to items.length, car basket.items.length. And now we can say store.cart is equal to current basket dot items, and then we can simply just map over our cart down here. And so we're going to have a conditional display, so it's going to say store.cart is greater than 0. If it's greater than 0, then we know what we want to render out, which is going to be a map of all the things. Otherwise, we have nothing in the cart, and we're just going to say div h3 your cart is empty, just like that. So currently we have nothing in the cart, so we would expect that to say your cart is empty. I'm just going to say class is equal to text small. So your cart is empty, just like that. And what we can also do is just for the actual modal, on a smaller screen, I want to change the width to just be about maybe 500 pixels. So it just comes across just like that. It's only partially on the side. And we can once again add a cursor pointer to this. Cursor pointer and then hover rotate 45. So now we come in here, that hovers and our cart is empty. And then on a small screen, it's just going to be the full width. And then on a bigger screen, it only occupies part of the width. So the next thing we can do is that if we do have things in our cart, we can instead change this into a div. Just like that. And what I want to do in here is have a background slate 900 flex col gap of maybe 1 pixel, and I'm actually going to make that maybe like a 400. And in here we can just have a bunch of divs, or more accurately map of all of the items that we have. So we can say store.cart.map, and this is going to be item, and here we can return a div, and this div is going to have a class equal to background white. We're going to have maybe like a padding of 4, or even maybe like, yeah, 4 is probably fine. We're going to say flex col, items center justify between, and in the first part we're going to have another div that has a class of flex col gap 1. We'll have to close that div. Is that correct? Yeah, that's correct. And in here we're just going to have the item.name. Well, actually, first what we're going to do is open that up. We're going to have an h2 that has the item.name, and then underneath we're going to have the paragraph, which is going to be the item.price, and then on the other side we're just going to have a little cancel button, which is conveniently going to be the exact same icon that we just have up here. So we can just copy this icon. In fact, to make it even simpler, we can come in here and just copy that X mark and have that show up here. And now what we're going to have to do is come back into our card and make sure that when we set that local state and we add to it, which is actually going to be in here, what we want to do is, instead of just pushing the state.name, we just want to push that entire state. So that's going to be that whole object, just like that. And that should mean that we can access everything in it. And so we can probably go ahead and trial this. There's our cart. We want Douglas. We adopt Douglas. We now have one item in our cart. We go to our cart and our cart is still empty, which means that something in here did not work. And so one of the issues that we're having is that when we add or adopt Douglas to the cart, we're actually having a reactivity issue where local state doesn't cause a re-render. And so what we're going to have to do for that instead is use a context. Now for the context, what we are going to do is come into our parent component, and we're going to first come up to the import section, and we're going to import use context. Just like that, use context provider, and create context and use store. Inside of our component, we're going to initialize our store. So we're going to say const, well, let's just call it state is equal to use store. And that's just going to have items, which is going to be like that. And now what we're going to do is initialize our context by saying export const my context is equal to use is equal to create context, and we're just going to call it my context. And then in here what we're going to just say is use context provider, and we'll pass in my context as an argument and our state, just like that. And what that will allow us to do is actually access that in multiple components. And so the first place we're going to have to use it is inside of this route. And because that's actually going to have to be a slightly more generalized context, we're actually going to need to just quickly copy this into our root.typescript file instead and update our imports to include that. So we're just going to have to say use store, create context, and use context provider. And then just copy that into here also, just like that. So that should initialize our context in our root, which means that we can access it from any particular route. And so now inside of our corgi, what we can do is access the context by just saying const context state is equal to use context, just like that. That will auto import it. And we'll also have to import my context. So that should be my context, just like that. And now we should be able to console.log context state, refresh that page, and that's all good. And so now what we should be able to do is, instead of, I mean, we can still set it to local storage, so that's absolutely fine. But instead what we're going to do is just set the context state to the new updated version. And so that's just going to be current basket dot, context state dot items dot push. And what we can do is just push the state instead, like that. And so now when we click on courgette, and add that to the context state, that should be added to our context. And so if we just quickly wanted to see that, we should be able to say context state.items.map and just have element. And in here, we can return just a div. We'll close the div, and that can have element.name. And since that didn't appear to be working, what we're going to do is just actually reset context.items to the current value of context.state.items, and then we're just going to add in the state as an additional entry. And so now when I refresh this page, we have 39 items. That doesn't really matter, but we should be able to go into our header. Well, actually, first we just want to come back down here and remove this, but we could also just check if it's working, and we can see that it is, because if I go adopt, we have a whole lot of Douglases, and then if I come into courgette and add, we get courgette being added too, so that's all good. However, the issue that we're now having that we can see is that when I go between the pages, we're actually losing our context, and there's a pretty easy fix for that, and we only have to add it in 2 places. We can just once again use this client effect, use client effects just like that. And we can just say if local storage.get item, and it's going to be corgi basket. So if it exists, then we can just say context state dot items is equal to json.parse local storage, this element just here, dot items. So that would just make sure that both of the 2 of them are synced. And likewise, when we come onto the home page, oh, that's weird, we just want local storage. And so now when we come onto the home page, we want the exact same thing to happen. So that's just going to be here. And we can literally copy that code just like that into our home index right here, after we obviously import the context. So we can just say, just like we did in here, do exactly that. We're just going to have to import, use context, and my context, just like that. So those 2 things. And obviously we need client effects too. So now we should have everything relatively synced. And so if I come into Douglas, we are getting that shared state rendering out, and we can see it all down there, adopting a whole lot of Douglases. And we can see that the number here matches the number in our basket, which is just what we want. So that is the most important thing. And now I can go ahead and remove this, and that should be nice and reactive. So let's just go ahead and come back to the main page. And now what we want to do is come into our header. And in here, we also want to access the context. So we're just going to copy that line across just like this. Once again, do all the imports, my context, just like that. And now we should be able to access this just here. And so instead of having the store.cart, what we could actually do is use watch, just like that. So that will have imported up the top. And in here, we just once again open it up with an anonymous function. In here, we're going to have to destructure track, because that's going to be important. And here we can say const cart, or we can call it temp cart, is equal to track. We pass in another anonymous function, and in this particular case, we're going to use the context state dot items. And so once we get that, we're just going to say store.cart is equal to temp cart. And now what we can do is update this. So, well, actually there's 2 things we can do. We can also change it so this will, instead of using the local storage, we can comment that out for the minute. And we can instead make it so that it just uses the length of this particular item. So we can take tempcart.length and say store.num items is equal to tempcart.length. So that still says 63. And then finally down here where we map out this particular element, we can change this so it says length, and we now get a whole lot of items here. And if we change the text color to Slate 900, we still get absolutely nothing, which is unusual. We might just take a second to just console.log temp cart. So that's giving us this array where each element is an object. So that right there is our issue. So what we're going to just have to quickly do is reset our local storage. So let's just delete everything in our basket. Make sure that when we add it, it's correct. So that is just going to be like that. So that's perfect. And so now we shop the corgis. Let's say we wanted noodle. We adopt noodle. We can check our console. We can see that that has already updated, which is perfect. And now when we come to our basket, we see that we do in fact have noodle for 4,000, which is perfect. And so now we can just fiddle with some of the styling here. So we could say that this is class text extra small, and once again pop a $sign in front of it. And so now we have our thing. However, what is happening is one of our use effects is broken, or our use client effects. And I think that the solution is going to be to just adjust the syntax right here so it looks more like that. So we had one here, and then we're just going to have to change that in here as well. Spread that. So now if we, because we don't want an array containing an array, that just doesn't make any sense. So now if we go into our application once again and just delete all of this stuff, come back onto the main page, we have Douglas. Douglas gets set to that state there, that's fine. We adopt Douglas, and it's items 0. So for some reason, having a slight issue in the way that it gets added, and so that is going to be in the products grid. No, sorry, it's going to be in the corgi page. So when we add an item, we push the state, and I think this is our issue right there. I think that's our big problem. So if we delete that key, adopt, now we should just have items, and it's the way that it should be. And so now we have two, we have one there, and we can see that that works perfectly. So there we have Douglas, and we could probably just leave it like that for the minute. I think is absolutely fine. And then if we close that, adopt a couple more, we can see that we have multiple Douglases. And the last thing to do is going to be to just allow that filtering. And so that is going to be in the header once again. And then we're just wanting to come into this little X and just bring it down a size so we can say text extra small. So that should drop the size of that element down, although it hasn't. And that's because it's the wrong one. So we actually want that to be there. So we can say text small. So now we should have some small little X's. And then we can give this an onClick event. Once again, an anonymous function, open that up. And we can just say, so this will have an index basically. And we can say context state.items is equal to the current context state.items.reduce, and here we're going to take an accumulator and a current and an index, and we'll open that up, and we want the default return to be an array, and we can say if index is not equal to I, then we want to return, spread the accumulator function with the current, and otherwise we just want to return the accumulator, and that should pretty much do it. We may just also want to have a cursor pointer and a hover opacity 40. So now when we have the state, we click close, it's just going to remove one. And if I go ahead and adopt, let's just say we adopt noodle. So here we have noodle, we adopt noodle. So now we have a couple of different ones. If I remove Douglas, it does indeed remove Douglas. And obviously the last thing our cart is going to need is a big fat checkout button at the bottom. And so we can just add that in here, and this can be a button that says checkout. We can say class, border, solid, border, slate, py, let's just say 8, text extra large. And we also want the modal, because we set the modal to have a height of the screen. We want to have overflow scroll. So now we have the scrolling on this particular element. Come to the home page, we have that scrolling, we have this scrolling. That all works nicely. And we obviously don't want that background color because that is atrocious. So we'll just set the background to white. Just like that. And so now we can access the cart. We have the cart here. Because we have a border set on everything, we're actually just going to say border bottom. Well, actually, no. What we'll do is we'll just say border bottom, border left, border right. I think should do the trick. And now we have our little checkout button down the bottom that we can click on. What you could also do, just to make it slightly more obvious that it's a large modal, is just give this a shadow so that it shadows the actual page a little bit. But on the whole, from there you would just go to a checkout page, wherever that may be, and purchase all of these beautiful animals. And so just like that, we have a fully functional application where we can adopt dogs, we have a cart, we can do just about everything, remove elements from the cart, and we've learned how to interact with Qwik and build amazingly fast applications, and basically everything we've done in this video should cover 99% of the bases that you need for building your own applications. So if you've enjoyed the video, please like and sub, and consider clicking the notification bell for all the amazing tutorials that are yet to come. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace. Yo, what's good, team? Post-editor note from James here. There's actually a couple of extra things that we could add to the store and refactor some of the code, including adding legitimate Stripe integration if you actually wanted to build your own store. And just, clean up some of the components, make it slightly more functional, build a product, improve the product description page and stuff like that. So if you want to make part 2 where we can just really flesh this out into the immaculate e-commerce store, leave a comment down below and I will make that happen and release it shortly. Catch you guys later. Peace.